Steph's reminder to keep anti-colonialist framework in mind, I think, leads nicely into the discussion that I hope we can get into around Iliam Burbano's presentation, who will be our second speaker. Iliam, like Steph, is a long-term activist and has been involved in a whole host of things in Toronto, but most perhaps relevantly to this discussion is a CUPE member of Labour for Palestine, and he also sits on the International Solidarity Committee of CUPE Ontario. So, Iliam.
I just like my anyway, I want to thank Cynthia for those nice introductions and for you to take the time. I know it's been a long day, particularly for the activists that have been here and are going to be here the whole week at the CLC. The fact that we're having this discussion kind of in a parallel room as opposed to during the convention gives you an idea of the centrality of some of these important struggles and the challenges that we face around bringing some of these struggles to the forefront of the labor movement. To discuss the need for sort of more militant and grassroots, rank and file, what we're calling in CUPE and what many other activists are calling worker-to-worker international solidarity or just labor activism, and the challenges that we're facing trying to do this type of organizing in the labor movement. I wanted to start by highlighting a recent action, a very positive and encouraging action that took place in the US. On May Day, 25,000 dock workers belonging to the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, the ILWU, shut down 29 ports on the US West Coast, grinding business to a halt in opposition to the Iraq War. This was a one-day work stoppage in which workers withheld their labor, demanding an end to the Iraq War and demanding a withdrawal of US occupation troops in Iraq. Also important to point out that this action also coincided, it didn't just have an anti-war focus, but it also linked up and coincided with other anti-war actions that were taking place, but with other very large mobilizations of thousands of activists across key cities in the US that were mobilizing in support of non-status and undocumented workers and communities, and also demanding for regularization. So I think the fact that the ILWU not only went beyond just sort of the strict confines of trade unionism, took work stoppage to demand an end to the war, and also linked up with broader struggles is some of the work that we need to do within the labor movement. Also, in terms of this kind of a key example of worker-to-worker solidarity, apparently at the same time as the ILWU took this work stoppage action, dock workers in Iraq also had a work stoppage or had a strike, literally under the guns of the armed occupation. So it gives you an example of links that can be made, obviously, across border. And the May Day slogan for this action was "No peace, no work, holiday." And I think it's also significant. The ILWU action is also significant because the rank and file members defied an order by an arbitrator that ordered them not to take this strike action. They also defied a lot of their leadership that, because the union's also coming up to a collective bargaining. So some of the union officials or the top leaders were not in agreement with the work stoppage. Obviously, they thought it was too radical and not necessarily on an issue that was a priority for the union. And I just wanted to quote Jack Hyman, who's a local activist with the ILWU, and in interviews after the action, some of the things that he said, he said, "We don't take orders from arbitrators or from judges. We take our orders from the rank and file membership, and they're the ones that tell us what we need to do." And the other thing that he said was that, this action was a way to try to raise union activism, raise the level of struggle of union activism from quote-unquote protest to resistance. And I think that's significant for the discussion that we want to have. The other point is the potential power of this work stoppage and the potential power that the ILWU and other unions have in terms of the strategic sectors of the economy that they're involved in. $1.2 trillion in business flows from the West Coast ports each year. So you can imagine the potential impact on the infrastructure, on the state, that the union can mobilize by these types of work actions. The other thing that I wanted to point out, because it connects to some of the discussion around Palestine and the anti-apartheid and BDS movement, is that the ILWU in 1984, during the height of the anti-apartheid movement, refused to work a South African ship that was docked in the San Francisco Bay for about 10 or 11 days. So I think that this recent ILWU work stoppage is a positive sign that, you know, some small sectors, maybe not yet significant sectors, but positive signs that small sectors of the labor movement may be starting to show some signs of life, and the willingness to mobilize around broader political struggles, not just within the strict confines of more traditional trade union struggles. Locally in Ontario and in the labor movement in Canada, as progressive left-wing activists and the socialists as well, we're facing some serious challenges in trying to mobilize in a more militant, in a more grassroots, in a more worker-to-worker model. But we've also had some positive experiences recently, particularly around the Palestine solidarity work. In terms of our experience in CUPE Ontario, one of the challenges of doing more progressive work around international solidarity struggles is that there's a lack of, basically political education that's being done around these issues in the union movement, and it's happening in our union as well. Despite the fact that, when you go to a union convention, I'm speaking for the union conventions that I've been at, which is CUPE National and CUPE Ontario, despite the fact that union leaders, there's always a lot of pronouncements and a lot of rhetoric that the union is active and defends and supports, and that international solidarity work is important, and that we need to make the links between the struggles locally against corporations, against privatization, with its impacts globally. Despite that rhetoric and those pronouncements and those strongly worded letters that a lot of our unions are constantly sending out denouncing the Afghanistan war or the occupation in Iraq, etc., in terms of actual campaigns that engage rank and file membership, the mobilizing and the organizing is not really that significant. The other issues that international solidarity issues are still, despite this rhetoric and these pronouncements, it's still seen by our membership as sort of issues that are still peripheral to trade unionism and not sort of traditional bread and butter issues like bargaining, like fighting for wages, fighting for pensions, for better benefits locally. And as a result, they're not issues that necessarily the union should focus on. So we're kind of dealing with that culture, which is also connected to the lack of education that happens around international solidarity struggles and around international solidarity issues, not only at convention, but in other union structures and spaces when workers, in our unions come together. I think the other factor that leads to international solidarity struggles being peripheral or not being central to trade unionism locally for us is that rank and file workers in our unions, are on the defensive in terms of, a decrease in wages, in terms of benefits, lack of pensions in a lot of our sectors, contracting out, casualization of labor. So when you're on the defensive and the union is not able to defend your rights as a worker locally, it's hard for you to kind of start saying, well, I need to kind of also think about what's happening in Colombia or what's happening in Iraq or what's happening in Iran, etc. So there's something that we're having to combat through the education is that, the rank and file membership, there's an inward kind of insular mentality, and an example of that is the resistance that we face with workers in our unions when we're opposing, for example, the war in Afghanistan. The difficulty we have around fighting such patriotic arguments such as that, the myth of Canadian peacekeeping in Afghanistan, or the fact that, you know, we need to defend our troops unequivocally despite the fact of their impact on Afghanistan, or despite the fact that we're supporting a counterinsurgency or an imperial agenda. And we have a hard time confronting those kinds of nationalist or patriotic arguments, trying to bring up the importance of imperialism. And sort of, so those are some of the challenges that we're facing in terms of the work that we need to do. The other challenge that we're facing is that a lot of the international solidarity work that is being done in our unions is increasingly being done, you know, either by a very small group of activists that have been around for a really, really long time, and in many cases also small group of paid staff that are doing a lot of the international solidarity work within the union. And increasingly, the pattern that some of us are seeing or are identifying is kind of an increasing reliance on more the administering of funds to partners internationally, often through NGOs, not necessarily supporting grassroots unions or movements. So the union, because the union movement in North America and in Canada, because we have a lot of financial resources in comparison to civil society or community organizations, and in comparison to unions internationally, that becomes the way we kind of do our international solidarity work, by administering funds, by supporting projects, in many cases not necessarily projects with a strong political agenda, but you know, sort of more humanitarian or kind of quote-unquote community development projects. And this sort of charity model, which I think a lot of activists are increasingly becoming critical of, and I'm sure that, you know, other activists in the labor movement have been critical of this charity model for a long time. The other problem with it is it reinforces that kind of dependency and that paternalistic relationship between, you know, as trade unionists in North America or in Canada that have a lot of money, you know, our main form of reciprocity and support is by, you know, providing the cash so that workers and social movements in other places kind of struggle on the front lines. And I think the ILWU example is an example of the strong political impact of when a union takes a work stoppage. They're not giving money, they're not funding a project, but they're acknowledging their complicity in the destruction of Iraq and the occupation of Iraq, and they're saying, in the sector of the economy that we are immersed in and we organize in, we will impact the state in solidarity with workers in Iraq. And I think we think that those are more the types of actions that are needed. Another challenge that we face is that, you know, the lack of renewal amongst the activists that are doing international solidarity work, and also the fact that the union structures are hard to access for the newer activists. So many of the unions have a select group of activists, sometimes even staff, that become sort of the experts on international solidarity issues. In many cases, not exclusively, but in many cases, they're older, white, male, and sometimes there's a resistance, and I don't think it's so much a resistance by these individuals, but by the structures that have been set up to kind of open up the space for the new generations of activists and the new vision around international solidarity work. So I think part of that struggle is just kind of greater equity within the union and opening up the structure so that the leadership in the union and the different committees in the union start representing the rank and file membership, which is, you know, obviously very diverse. The last comments that I want to make are sort of, we think, key examples of worker-to-worker solidarity, which have been expressed particularly in the last couple of years in support of the Palestinian solidarity movement. First of all, obviously, you know, I would like to talk about Resolution 50. And the importance of Resolution 50 is that, you know, in 2005, over 170 Palestinian civil society organizations, including the labor movement, we have one of the members of the executive committee of the PGFTU that is here, after many, many years of failed peace processes, of increased settlements, of increased violence impacting primarily Palestinians, unarmed Palestinians at that, the Palestinian people called for a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign modeled on the South African anti-apartheid movement. And I think the significance of Resolution 50 is that a union in Canada answered that call of fellow brothers and sisters in Palestine to say, we won't just make pronouncements about the fact that we need peace in the Middle East, or that we abhor violence on both sides, or we talk about the roadmap or the Oslo peace process. We said we will take action through boycott, divestments, and sanctions to impact the state that is the oppressor, because this is not a conflict amongst equal sides. The Palestinian people are colonized, they're under occupation, and they're being discriminated. And the importance of CUPE passing Resolution 50, one of the most far-reaching resolutions in the labor movement in support of Palestine. And some of the gains that up to date that have been made is that we survived the backlash that was immense initially. Also that we implemented the resolution. Many resolutions are left on the paper, not just in CUPE, but across the labor movement in this country. And the fact that in the last 2 years, CUPE Ontario has implemented one of the most comprehensive, rank-and-file driven and led education campaigns about Israeli apartheid, supporting the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, and supporting the Palestinians. And a further gain in April 2008, as you know, the Canadian Union of Public Employees became the first national union to pass a similar resolution supporting the boycott, divestment. Pardon me? Canadian Union of Postal Workers, sorry.
That's been a union rating going on here.
I'm also insular looking. CUPW also passed, it's the first national union in North America to pass a resolution supporting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And the last thing that I just want to mention, just to wrap up, is that as a result of all these initiatives and by self-organizing as rank-and-file activists without big financial support for the union structures, we're holding a Labor for Palestine conference at the end of the CLC, and we have union activists coming from across Canada, including Quebec. We have a representative of the PGFTU, and we also have 5 people coming from the United States, and we have unions. Not only we have representatives of CUPW, OSSTF, CAW, steelworkers, and so it just shows the work that we can do as activists, establishing our own networks, self-organizing, and moving the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement forward. So we hope that you will come. It is an organizing conference. It isn't a conference for pronouncements or rhetoric. It's for us to build this movement.